Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, the fourth keynote speech in this year's Vienna Humanities Festival. It's also the last keynote speech, although, of course, the festival, which has been running all day today in the Academy of Fine Arts, will be running again tomorrow, and there are lots of really fascinating talks, so please do come along. Before I introduce this evening's guest, I would like to thank our primary sponsor of the Vienna Humanities Festival, the OSF, the Open Society Foundation. Thank you very much indeed. You're really helping to get a vibrant discourse going here in Vienna, which we're extremely pleased to be part of. But now to our guest. He was teaching at Princeton University for 33 years, becoming, of course, professor there. Many years ago, he is a fellow at the Hoover Institute, at Stanford University. He's probably most widely known for his, so far, 2-volume biography of Joseph Stalin. But I remember when his book Magnetic Mountain came out in 1995, and I devoured it then. I thought it was a path-breaking piece of history because it looked at Stalinism from below, from the lived experience of people involved in an extraordinary political, social engineering project in Magnitogorsk. Since then, he's gone on to so many great things that I'm not going to enumerate them here. He is going to give us a talk, and after that, the permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, Ivan KRASTEV, is going to join him on stage and we'll have a conversation. I know you're not going to be disappointed this evening. Please let me welcome to the stage Professor Stephen Kotkin.
Wow. I don't know, maybe I did fantasize one day that I would be speaking in a venue like this, in a city like this, but the fact that it's happened, I'm a little bit astonished. Let me thank the Institute for Human Sciences, where 7 years ago I gave a series of lectures. Tremendous intellectual enterprise that they have. Let me also thank Time to Talk, Desi Gavrilova, anybody who's enjoyed the festival so far and into tomorrow should be deeply grateful for the unbelievable work that she's done and her team has done. Thank you as well for the honor of the invitation to be up here. I first came to Vienna a little more than 40 years ago to the Goethe Institute, and I stayed at a place called Kolping House, which had a strict curfew and required a level of behavior that I was not really fully capable of at that age. And there were some disciplinary infractions. But I did learn the city really well. And today I was able to take my 5.5K run around the ring this morning before the city woke up. It's just breathtaking. One of the great cities in the world. My family also should be mentioned here. This morning, my wife and I, who's an art curator, chief art curator, went to the opening of the Chagall at the Albertina. My family, the Kotkins, are from Vitebsk, the same city as Chagall. And if you go to the exhibition and you see that rooster flying up and out of the village, that's my great-great-grandfather who left Chagall, who left Vitebsk, and Chagall was able to immortalize that moment. My mother's side of the family is from Polish Catholics from Krakow. And so, yes, I am that Russian Empire, Austrian Empire, crazy combination that you know well, which may explain part of what's going to happen, but not everything. Sorry, Lenny. You know, there's this tortoise, and it's just making its way. No big deal. Slowly, as tortoises do, making its way. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, it's attacked. It's attacked by a slug. And the slug attacks the tortoise and mugs it. Right there in broad daylight. The tortoise calls the police to report the incident. And the police wants to take a statement, says to the tortoise, what happened? And the tortoise says, you know, it happened so fast, I don't really know. Yeah, that's tonight's lecture. I understand Yvonne is going to come up now for a conversation. Yeah, history looks like it moves really, really fast, and things change really quickly, and there are these tremendous changes, and maybe it doesn't move as fast as we think. Maybe the changes are less abrupt, less deep, less fundamental. That's not to say things don't change, but there's a difference between the conjuncture that we're in and that we feel and that we live and the longer-term trends in the fullness of time. So I'm going to give just 2 points to illustrate that statement, one about geopolitics and one about democracy, if you'll bear with me. So you say to yourself, geez, you know, what if I went 50 years into the future from today? What would I see? No doubt I would see a world completely transformed, things that I didn't have any notion might even be possible. Well, let's try that. We can't go 50 years into the future, at least not yet. But let's try that by going 50 years backwards and putting ourselves in the shoes of the people who were alive 50 years ago, fell asleep in that proverbial fairy tale, missed everything, but then woke up 50 years later, and what would they see? So you'll recall 50 years ago, there was a confrontation, a Cold War, between the United States, its allies and partners, which was quite substantial allies and partners overall. In fact, West Germany and Japan, the two principal enemies of the United States in World War II, had been folded into the U.S. maritime open international system. This is the most astonishing transformation probably ever in geopolitics, where your two worst enemies in a war, a total war that's, I don't have to give you a characteristic of it, you know what it was like. And then the next thing you know, they're among your closest allies and partners, and they're the second and third biggest economies in the world and part of your system. And I could go on. Well, that's the world you would have been living in 50 years ago, but you would have been opposed by a Eurasian land empire, much older than your American-led international system, in fact, much older than the existence of the United States. And it was autocratic rather than democratic, didn't have the rule of law. It was a trading power only to a limited extent, unlike you and your friends and allies who invented the open trading system, international economic order. And not only that, it was very angry, resentful, but really angry that you were in charge. Who put you in charge? Who put the United States and its allies in charge? This upstart nation, very arrogant, lecturing everybody, barely a blip in history, and They organize the world. They tell you what to do. They control the international financial system. They have 50, 60, 70 alliances. How did this happen? We're Russia. We predate you by a millennium. And this contest, this struggle between the Eurasian land empire, that is, has a different model of power, and the American-led maritime order, very different model of power. This struggle persisted for a really long time to today. To today. That's the world we still live in. There are some differences, really important differences. Today, it turns out that the Chinese, instead of being the junior partner, are the senior partner in the anti-Western opposition. If you knew your history, and I'm sure this being Vienna, you do, unlike some of the audiences I speak to, let's say, back where I'm from. You know, where history is what happened yesterday, right? Or maybe this morning. Or maybe who cares? Yes, I know, but I'm one of them. So you can always talk about your own. If you knew the fullness of history, you would know that the Chinese as the senior partner, as one of the most powerful countries in the world, is a normal course of world history up until about 1800. And so the Chinese being the senior partner and Russia being the junior partner, this is kind of surprising, but is it really surprising? There's a little change here with Iran, because up until 1979, Iran was on the American side under the Shah. And then there's the Islamist revolution, and Iran flips to the anti-Americanism. Iran flips. And so now you have not just the Soviet Union and its satellites and partners, but you have instead China and its satellites and partners, including Russia and Iran. It's not an alliance. Authoritarian regimes don't have trust among other authoritarian, let alone, they don't have trust inside their own regime, let alone with others, so it's always a little bit awkward when they make partnerships. There's always wondering about whether it's going to endure or not, and for how long. But anyway, so this is the same world that you would have seen had you been alive 50 years ago. I see most of you were not alive 50 years ago based on the demographics. The lighting is not that good, but I was around then in the 1970s. And so when we say the world is changing, what's the world and what precisely is changing? So the US-led international order, for all its faults, for all its disappointments, for all its failures, including Vietnam and the atrocities that the US committed there, and many other examples that if you had the microphone instead of me, you could mention. For all of those things, I know what people are thinking. You think I don't know? You think this is my first lecture? It's my second. I was in Sofia, Bulgaria a couple of days ago. And I was winging it there at a magnificent venue. If you look, you see, the US-led international order and American power and the alliances, and it's all still there. It's been enlarged. It was enlarged to what used to be called Eastern Europe and the Baltic states. They were included, folded into this US-led order, becoming members of NATO, becoming members of the European Union. It got enlarged. It's still strong in East Asia on what we call the first island chain, stretching from the Korean Peninsula, the southern part, of course, of the Korean Peninsula, down through Japan, all the way to Australia. All of that is still the world. And the opposition has been rearranged a little bit, but still very similar. Autocratic, anti-Western, especially anti-American, beneficiaries of the US-led international system, but resentful and angry about it, and seeking potentially to overturn it, but at least to reshape it for their interests. Okay. So that didn't change. That's our world today. So what did change? Well, a couple of really big things changed. For one thing, everybody is now connected. All of you in this room can take out your computers. They're called phones now. I don't know why. Nobody calls anybody. They just text, especially if you're standing next to each other. But you can take out your pocket computers, and you can explain to anybody, or you can live stream by turning on your microphone, just what I'm doing now, to any part of the world. This is completely new. There wasn't something like this in the 1970s. Not even in an incipient fashion. As connected as the world was in the 70s, it pales into comparison to what we have now, the tech revolution. So that's a really big difference, and it's been very destabilizing to have everybody and everyone everywhere connected at all times, so that everything that happens in one place happens everywhere in real time in some fashion. This is really difficult to assimilate. It's empowering in all sorts of ways that you understand, and also destabilizing. So that's a really big change. How are we going to manage that? Another big change is social media. Everyone in this theater is a publisher now. You are all publishers. You can all write and send out, disseminate, speak, write, play act, anything you want at any time, and nobody can stop you. Sure, they can try to stop you, right? I mean, I was at Princeton University for 33 years, which we know as the life of Jesus. Yes, it's true. And I left just before being crucified. Not because I was afraid to be crucified, but because I had doubts about the resurrection. Whether I was going to come back on Sunday or not. I didn't think it was going to happen. Maybe it happened once. I wasn't there. But in my case, for sure, no. And I got out. So even when they want to stop you, they can't stop you. You leave and you show up at Stanford University. Ha! How's about that? Wait till they find out at Stanford that I'm there. Anything can happen. Anyway, so just to finish this point, you're all publishers now. And that's a really enormous destabilizing factor that we haven't figured out what to do with yet. The third really gigantic change is that those non-Western or anti-Western ancient Eurasian land empires, their borders are borders of defeat. The Soviet borders were borders of victory. I mean, not victory for Bulgaria, not victory for the Baltic states, but victory for the Soviet Union. And so the Soviets could become a status quo power. They could enter into deals with the United States to, quote, stabilize the international order because they liked it, that they had the borders of victory. They could do the Helsinki 1975 Accords, mutually recognizing their borders. They could concede a human rights clause that they didn't think was very important because they got recognition of their borders of victory. Today, the borders are borders of defeat. It's very hard to stabilize relationships with your adversaries when they're borders of defeat. There are 3 places on the globe where the US-led international order is territorially vulnerable. It's been the case for 30 years. How do I know that? I've been talking about it for 30 years. And sadly, very sadly. And here we are. What are those three places? Yes, of course, it's obvious now. Crimea, Ukraine, borders of defeat for Russia. Israel, borders of defeat for Iran and Iran's proxies and the Arabs of Palestine. And of course, South China Sea, Taiwan. Taiwan is what? A government in exile from the 1949 Civil War. That's not over yet. Borders of defeat. How do you stabilize relationships with your anti-Western adversaries when we have borders of defeat? Remember, China has only one coast. China has no California. That's the most important geopolitical fact you're ever going to hear. The United States has two coasts, and they're both moats protecting the country, and they're highways of commerce. China's west coast, where we have California, is desert, and getting bigger desert, and it's also ethnic minorities, who in some cases live in the equivalent of concentration camps, and are seen as a threat, rightly or wrongly. That's China's west coast. China's east coast is completely hemmed in by U.S. military bases and U.S. allies and partners. So if you're sitting there in Beijing, you're looking at the map, the United States is this superpower with the Atlantic, the Pacific, right? With Mexico, Canada, fish, and fish. And you've got desert and ethnic minorities that you fear, and then you've got a hemmed-in coastline where the U.S. is all over the place with its quiet, nuclear-powered submarines. So this is a big problem for them to figure out, and for us to figure out how to manage that, because tensions are manageable provided each side can find some type of equilibrium in the international system as it currently is. And it's clear that in these three places, Crimea, Ukraine, Israel, and larger Near East, and South China Sea, Taiwan, the Chinese are trying to push us out of the South China Sea and make it their own lake like the United States did with the Caribbean. Okay, so there are many other changes, don't get me wrong. I could talk about the other changes. I'm just giving the most superficial talk imaginable. The big structures that aren't changed and the big changes that have happened. If you were alive 50 years ago, you would have seen the U.S. lose the Vietnam War. Little did you know that the U.S. was going to win the peace in the fullness of time. And Vietnam, despite all the atrocities, was going to become a pro-American country. Amazing, you could lose the war and win the peace. You can also win the war and lose the peace, like the U.S. recently in Afghanistan. You got to win the peace, not just the war. But in the fullness of time, things are possible. Okay, so this is the geopolitical point. I'm now going to move on to just make a few idiotic remarks about democracy, and then close and bring Yvonne back to the stage. This man and woman, happily married, are sitting around having a conversation. And the wife, they're having some wine, so the conversation is becoming a little bit freer than maybe is advisable. And the wife says to the husband, "Honey, if something happened to me, would you remarry?" The husband says, "No way, I could never do that." And she said, "You know, I would want you to." And he says, "Okay, if it would make you happy, I'll do it. But of course, nothing's going to happen to you." And then she says, "And if you remarried, would you let her sleep in our bed? The husband says, of course not. And the wife said, well, that would be dumb. I mean, if you and she were married. The husband says, okay, I guess so. And then the wife says, they're sitting at a golf course. They've just finished the round. They're at the clubhouse, and her golf bag is on one side and his is on the other. And she's quite attached to her golf bag and clubs. And she says, and would you let her use my golf clubs? And he says, oh, that's impossible. And she said, why? And he says, because she's left-handed. Yep. It's cruel. The world is cruel. I'm sorry. I apologize. I should have asked first. Normally, I don't do the geopolitical stuff. I just do those kind of jokes. But those videos are not on YouTube. When I was growing up, I said I wanted to be a comedian, and they all laughed at me. But they're not laughing now. It's too late. All right, the democracy stuff. We just are having the most amazing, successful year in the history of democracy, in the recorded history of democracy. That's right. 70 countries are voting this year. That's never happened before. 8 of the 10 most populous countries are holding national elections this year. China doesn't have elections, it's one of the 10, and Brazil recently had their elections just a few years ago. But otherwise, 8 of the 10 most populous and more than 70 countries overall are voting. That's more than 2 billion eligible voters. Think about that. That's just breathtaking, especially if you had been alive in 1974. When, of course, Brazil, South Africa, Iberian Peninsula, I could go on. The progress that we've made in democracy since '74, just breathtaking. But the social media stuff is extremely destabilizing for democracy. We haven't figured it out yet. This is the 3rd time. The first time was radio. Yeah, radio. These people could broadcast anything into people's living rooms, right into their homes. And the intelligentsia could do nothing about it. They couldn't tell you what to think or how to think or what to listen to. They just broadcast it right into your homes. And they could just say anything on the radio. They could just make it up. It could be like lies and demagogy and right into your living rooms simultaneously across a whole country, in some cases across borders. And you know, Mussolini was good at radio. He wasn't good at much else, but he was really good at radio. And Goebbels was good at radio. Stalin was not so good at radio, but he had Yuri Levitan, Voice of Moscow, radio. It was the end of civilization. It was the end of democracy. The authoritarians were better. And lo and behold, we managed somehow to assimilate radio. And we got Roosevelt, who was also pretty good at radio. And then the same damn thing happened again, but this time with images. It was television. And again, they could broadcast right into your home. And nobody could stop them. And they could say anything they wanted. They could just make it up. And during the television era, we had this talk again of end of civilization, threat to democracy. How are we going to manage this? Free for all, anything and everything, lies and demagogy. And we got Kennedy. We got John F. Kennedy. He went to debate this guy named Nixon. Is Nixon still in the history books? He went to debate this guy Nixon, and Kennedy was this complete hologram, empty vessel, beautiful person, charismatic, beautiful wife, beautiful family. And Nixon was just this guy with a big resume, had done a lot of things, but sweated bullets and took the thing out of his pocket to try to take the sweat off his face, and he just looked terrible. He's pasty. He was worse than me. And we got Kennedy. And so here we are, third time. Again, the end of the world, the end of democracy, the end of civilization as we know it. The authoritarians are good at this manipulation, the social media. And what did we get? Yes, we got Trump. We got Trump. So Roosevelt, Kennedy, Trump. I'll let you characterize that trajectory as you see fit. This is the third time, but the difference this time is not that just the people who control broadcasts can broadcast into your home. It's that you are the broadcasters now. Everybody is a broadcaster now. So we haven't assimilated this yet, and there's great fear that this is going to be big trouble. We'll see. I don't know. Okay. Another big problem for democracy besides the social media, the third and more difficult version of this problem, the other problem of this challenge of broadcasting anything and everything directly to people, the other problem is that gigantic organization structures get worse over time. Their performance declines. So governance structures begin to deteriorate. They begin to perform worse and worse. And the irony is we begin to ask it to do more and more. Very few organizations that get gigantic get better. Their performance improves. Basic organizational theory, the first day in organizational theory, they tell you that there's a problem in size. And no matter how well-intentioned, no matter how good the people, and civil servants are often very good people, no matter how good, the performance of that system gets worse. And here we are in an epoch where we wanted to do more and more and more, while its delivery of basic services in the areas it should function in is not necessarily improving and in many cases declining. So we're now on a trajectory where it's going the wrong way. The performance is declining and the demands on it to perform are increasing. And I got to tell you, some people are dissatisfied with the performance of government. They're dissatisfied. For whatever reason, they're not happy. The economy can be growing. They can be getting their share of whatever it is that the government has promised them. They can be doing just fine, but their mood is sour. Their mood is very sour. Part of that is cultural. We have a deep, profound, unbridgeable, in many cases, cultural divide now, amplified by freighting more and more onto government and amplified by the fact that every one of you is a publisher. We have deep, irreconcilable differences about when life begins. Does it begin at conception or does it begin at birth? It's hard to find a compromise on questions like that. And I could go on to many other deep and fundamental cultural divides that have been amplified by the freighting onto government and especially by the social media. So what we see on the left is, you tell me. You tell me what we see. They take credit for building the welfare state, which they now can't afford because of the demographic situation. The promises that the state makes in the better off countries can't be paid by fewer workers and more retirees or more people health care. Last year of life is 33% of American healthcare spending. Last year of life, that's it. To prolong life for a few months is 33% of American health. Who can afford that? America can't afford that. We're broke. And so the left, what's their story? What do they offer? Can't offer more welfare state. Often the left is reducing the welfare state. Can offer some redistribution and more welfare state, but can't pay for it. So destroy the fiscal balance, the fiscal situation. That's happening right in front of our eyes. So anybody here who's younger than 90, we're bankrupt and we got nothing for you as you reach the flower of development. This is across the developed world. Okay. What do they offer on the right? Nativism. Nativism. Nativism is sometimes a blood and soil variant. Sometimes it's a lighter, easier variant than that. And the crazy thing about nativism is that it's got an electoral path to power. You can talk about us versus them. You can talk about the internal enemies and the external enemies, immigrants, Roma, Jews, George Soros. There's just a full grab bag. You go down to the well, and it's never dry. This nativism is just phenomenal. It's an electoral path to power. It doesn't have to always be really hard-edged. It, as I say, can be a softer-edged version. What's the electoral path to power for the left? Anti-capitalism? You can't get elected. There's no electoral path to power with anti-capitalism. Who's going to vote to give up their property, to have their property expropriated? I hereby vote for you to take all my property away. I hereby vote for you to take away my assets, my children's assets. Anti-capitalism can only be imposed by a party of a new type, administratively, as Lenin called it, or as we call it today, human resources. Yeah, human resources. I see this every day. I'm at a university, remember, where we have nothing but party of a new type trying to impose this on us. Yeah, because they can't do it electorally. So the left is a little bit imbalanced with the right. The right has this secret sauce, nativism. The problem with nativism, as you know, is it doesn't deliver anything tangible. It doesn't improve the lives of the people. It doesn't increase opportunity. It doesn't increase prosperity. It doesn't make institutions function better and increase the quality of their performance. But it can get you elected. On the left, it's really hard. So each side, in a way, has hit a wall, and what they promise is what? Let's spend more of the money we don't have to keep people happy. Any of you remember Eastern Europe in the 70s and 80s? Let's borrow in Deutschmark and other amazing currencies and import consumer goods, and then, how are we going to pay this stuff back? Nobody buys our stuff. We don't have any foreign currency. Right? Okay. So this fiscal volcano, fiscal irresponsibility, is how the left makes up for its problems and the right makes up for its problems. Let's think about this election in the United States. I know that you're voting tomorrow. I'll stay out of that. We did catch some interesting political activity am Graben the other day, my wife and I. Oh, what's this? Anyway, again, some people know their history and some people are from America. We know some, not that much. And so you see this and you think, okay, the fiscal volcano, the U.S., all this talk about this is the most consequential election ever. It's the end of the world, it's apocalypse. So on the one side, what do we have? We have the fourth Obama term. The fourth Obama term in 5 cycles. That's what's offered to us. You'll know from American politics that each term tends to be a little bit less effective than the previous term. And some of the people who come into the administration are a little bit less effective than the ones who went out the third term or the second term. It's not always the A team in the fourth term. Even if it wasn't a hologram who's up for election, you would be predicting that the fourth Obama term might not be unbelievably efficacious. You might be wrong, but you'd be looking at that saying, what does that really promise? Fiscal irresponsibility. Let's be more fiscally irresponsible. And let's mismanage American power in the world as much as we can. And then on the other side, you have the second, that is the lame duck term of Trump. Trump's second term will be his final term if he gets elected. And you know from history that the second terms of presidents tend not to go too well. So you have this mendacious, incompetent, everything else that you know about Trump. And he'll be a lame duck from the first day. And what's he promising? Guess what he's promising? Yes, fiscal irresponsibility. I'll cut everybody's taxes, and nobody will pay taxes on their tips or on their money or on anything. In fact, I'll just pay you. That used to be called a Ponzi scheme where we were growing up, and now it's called the U.S. government. So that's what's on offer to the American people, and they're divided and confused. The election is consequential, certainly, for some people and for some issues. But to a person like me, what does it look like? Let's remember there have been 4 modern landslides in American history. Roosevelt, especially the big 1940 landslide. But Roosevelt won big. There was something lasting and enduring that came out of that landslide, the America that we know today. The next really big landslide was Lyndon Johnson in 1964 against Barry Goldwater. He crushed him. And 4 years later, Johnson didn't even run. He was gone. So much for that landslide. And then another big landslide was, 1972. Nixon. He almost swept the table. And how long was it after that landslide that he resigned? Not very long. Poof, gone. Johnson, poof. Nixon, poof. And then, of course, Reagan, especially in '84, where Reagan ran on the same platform in '84 and got a landslide victory that Goldwater had run on in '64 and been crushed in a landslide the other way. And the results of the Reagan landslide? Did government shrink? Did government become more responsible? Government in the Anglo-American sphere shrank once across a generation in recorded history, in the period after 1815 when Napoleon was defeated. That's it. Otherwise, it's been secular trend up. So you look at these actually consequential elections in which landslides happened, and only one seems to have been enduring. The Roosevelt one. You could argue that the Reagan one was partially enduring. I think I would support that argument. But certainly not in the dimensions that Roosevelt's has been. So in the fullness of time, maybe democracy is stronger than we think. Maybe the institutions are stronger than we think. Maybe the differences are great, but not as great as we think. Maybe the outcomes, the order, the republic, the international order doesn't necessarily ride on them, although, as I said, they're consequential for many people and many issues. I'm concerned that American power is undermining itself because of the Ponzi scheme fiscal irresponsibility that has no end. I'm concerned about the social media, how to assimilate that, because if you're a free society, you have to be a free society. You can't use unfree methods to be a free society. That doesn't really work. You might as well just not be a free society. So on the democracy thing, I'm bullish, and yet I'm quite concerned. But concerned for different reasons, I think, for most people. Even though I'm going to live to see this, I hope, and even though my wife and I have 2 children who are really geared into what the future might be. Okay, let me conclude this, and then we'll invite Yvonne up to the stage. I've gone on longer than I promised I would. Not for the first time. As I said, this is my second lecture. Many things I left out. Demography. I'm not going to talk about demography deeply. There are more people under 25 in Africa today than people alive in Europe. That's going to be a big thing to manage. The global economy and the tariffs and issues with trade and supply chains and pagers and walkie-talkies and just huge issues. I'm leaving all of that out in the presentation, although that's fair game. But what I've tried to show you is that the world has in some ways changed a lot less than we think. The changes have not always been enduring, but some of the recent changes have been deeper and bigger, and they're still within the shells of what we inherited, that US-led international order with the opposition from the Eurasian land empires. Can that be managed going forward, given what the bigger changes have been? Hot war, we all know what happened with that. We all know the consequences of great power war. That's why the EU exists today. Can they be managed? And can democracy assimilate these challenges of promising everything to everybody and then just throwing money around, and then managing the public sphere when everyone's a publisher, and managing the difference between the material achievements and the sour mood, especially among our younger people? Those are challenges that I see as deep and fundamental, and I'm not sure that the government we inherited, the institutions, the structures of government, the kind of government practice that we have, is fit for purpose going forward. But let me end on a positive note. Biology. Biology. Yes. I know, that's what kind of positive note is biology? Biology. You will live to see the world become a bioeconomy. Yes, it's already underway. Almost 5% of the US economy is the bioeconomy right now. Healthcare, food and agriculture, industrial processes. But I don't mean pharma. And I don't mean solely or predominantly genetically modified crops. I mean your body is going to become your hospital. Your cells are going to become your laboratories for testing whether you are sick or not, and how to fix whether you're sick. So instead of taking a COVID test and sending it out to a gigantic laboratory that costs $300 million and waiting a week to get the result back, you're going to be able to take stuff from somewhere else in your body and put it up your nose, and your boogers are going to turn purple if you have COVID. Otherwise, you don't have COVID. How do I know that? We have that now. We have that at Stanford University now. And I could go on with many examples of this bioeconomy, this biology, and the most amazing thing about it, there are so many amazing things. You want to store your data? You can store it on DNA. You can't see DNA with the naked eye, but you can store more data on DNA than you can store anywhere else. And we have DNA that was frozen in the tundra that's 750,000 years old. Good luck, any of your data today lasting 750,000 years in the storage systems that you're using. I got a bunch of floppy disks in my drawer where I have all these great things I wrote in the 90s. Yeah, exactly. Useless. So there's so much that biology can do. Yeast can produce the precursors for chemicals that can make oil. Yes, yeast. So instead of having a beer hall, you can make energy. You can do anything with biology. And biology, you have it. It's yours. And poor countries have it too. And it's in your garden. And it's outside your door. And it's in your body. It's nature, it's everything. And this is your future. And the amazing thing about this in terms of democracy and geopolitics is that it's potentially distributed power. Remember we lived through the tech revolution? Remember that? And everything was going to be free. Information was going to be free, and everybody was going to be empowered and connected to everybody else. Until, lo and behold, it's Amazon and Microsoft and Google and Facebook in China. That's it. That's the tech revolution. And we're all free, kind of. Yes. But it doesn't have to be that way with biology. There can be a way in which it doesn't fall into a centralized model, but falls into a decentralized or distributed model. So that countries can figure out how to grow their food, how to find their energy, how to build their laboratories and hospitals with individuals. Teenagers can do this now. We have people in the laboratories. We had this at Princeton, we have it at Stanford. They're 18 years old. They sign a piece of paper that says, I won't bring the new forms of life that I make in the lab home with me to the dorm. And they're 18. So it's happened already. And people are going to focus on the terror, the horror, the things that can go wrong. And not just because social media, not just because the business model is extremism, but because we have AI now. And when they ask the AI people to testify about the dangers, you know what they say? Bioweapons. They're blaming biology for their problems. You see, they're diverting the things that AI causes to go wrong to the biology. You go talk to the biologists. They're the problem with AI. You leave us alone. And we're falling for that. So we're going to focus on the terror, the things that can go wrong. We have a complete set of bioweapons in existence now, created by Mother Nature. You want some anthrax? You want some typhus? You want some polio? We have them in the refrigerator. We don't need any bioweapons. The problem with bioweapons is delivery vehicles, but we have those too. So we don't need the bioweapons that people are fearing, because we have plenty now. But guess what the solution to bioweapons is? Biology, like the mRNA vaccine, which is bioengineering, and which was developed faster than any other vaccine and is extremely efficacious. I've now had 4 shots. I know you, I see a lot of people looking at me like, is he too close? I should have mentioned that at the front end. Anyway, just let me conclude with this lunacy that biology is potentially the newest and most efficacious toolkit in the democratic toolbox, and can get us to a future of abundance, including in energy, but as well as in health and so many other applications, industrial processes, materials. You ever seen plexiglass? A little bit of bioengineering and that plexiglass is stronger than anything on Earth. Just from bioengineering a few cells. It can do so much for us, but mostly it can enable a path forward for democracy, for distributed power, for countries that don't have the wealth, the natural resources that Mother Nature put under, the earth hundreds of millions of years ago. It can be a democratizing force not only inside countries but potentially between countries, and that's up to us to figure out how to do that. We can do that. We have agency. It's possible that we can shape the biological economy, the biological future, the bioengineering that's already underway. It's not something happening later. It's happening already. It's 40 years already. That we can shape that in a more democratic fashion and get out of the cul-de-sac that we're in, that I described in the section on democracy, and maybe even manage the geopolitical that I described in the first point. Anyway, at that point, this crazy notion of biology being linked to democracy, I'll thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The only reason I was invited to be part of this conversation about the future is that in my country, Bulgaria, we have more fortune tellers per capita than anywhere in the world. And because negotiating and conversing with a comedian is not easy, I'm going to tell you that two of them met. And one said to the other, I'm seeing the future. You're well. How am I? And I'm starting with this because...
Oh no, Ivan, are we in Eastern Europe again?
I'm saying this because in my view this is extremely important because historians all the time talk about the future and the present, pretending that they're not doing this. And on this you are very different. You're engaging yourself, you're basically trying to see it, and one of the major arguments that you have been making is, yes, there is a change. But the change is probably much more modest than we're trying to imagine, and everybody believes that the time in which you're living is the most revolutionary time of all. But I remember the Chinese president being in Moscow last year, and he says, we are witnessing a transformation and a change that we have not seen in the last 100 years. And I read this summer Hungarian Prime Minister saying, we are seeing a change that we have not seen in the last 500 years. So my question is, to what extent how we are conceptualizing where we are living is not in fact the very definition of the moment in which we are living. I don't believe that any moment has a kind of a nature of its own, but if you have a political leaders who believe that we're living in a revolutionary time, they're going to act accordingly.
Yes.
And just finishing on this, in my view, is also the problem with the relations of history. I was always asking a very simple question. You know that annexation of Crimea happened in 2014. And this was exactly the moment...
Excuse me, it happened in 1783.
No, I agree, but the annexation of Crimea, my idea is, and this happened at the moment in which everybody was talking about 100th anniversary of the World War I. And by the way, they were reading Christopher Clark, who was with us just yesterday, and when you're reading the book, it was about overreacting. Yes. It was about basically ending up in a catastrophic war by accident.
Yes.
My question to you is, what was going to happen and what was going to be the reaction if the same thing has happened in 2038, when there are going to be all these books about 100th anniversary of Munich, and the politicians were going to read only these books. Right. So this is my story about the relations between history and the current moment.
Thank you, yes. So if you were at the lecture last night about 1848, you would have heard about the expectations associated with 1848, 1849, and the disappointments of living through that revolutionary epoch that didn't quite become the turning point. It didn't turn. But in the fullness of time, did it not turn to a very great extent? So again, it's this time frame problem of what you're measuring, right? If you're measuring, for example, the performance in World War II as of 1942, you're thinking Germany is winning and probably going to win the war, and the Soviet Union has been defeated and can barely salvage anything. But let alone the fullness of time, it's just a few more years, and you have a complete reversal of this. So it's always about the time frame that you choose. The other point you said is agency, acting based upon assumptions about the future. Right? One of the amazing things we know about great power war is that it's often when they think that it's going to be worse for them to launch a war in a few years. So they're not ready now, but the other side will be more ready. It'll be readier in a few years. So now is the moment that's closing, the window that's closing. In some ways, this is Germany's approach to both world wars. And so the hawks in the United States are all talking about getting ready because we're not ready. And so if you're sitting in Beijing, you're watching the United States belatedly mobilize for a potential World War III, not to fight it, but to be ready to fight it and therefore to deter it, to prevent it happening. And you think, well, in 5 years, they'll be a lot readier for this than they are now. So isn't this the more propitious moment to do something, because in 5 years will be worse, the balance of forces will be worse. And so this is the paradox of being a hawk. The paradox of being a hawk is you argue that to deter war, you have to be ready to fight war. But by getting ready to fight war and declaring your desire and your mobilization to be ready to fight war, you are creating perverse incentives for the adversary that you're trying to deter. Moreover, China is not an open society or an open political system. It's the largest economy in world recorded history that is opaque, that we don't understand the decision-making processes, that we don't have. The United States, unfortunately, we understand too much, right? It's like pornography. It disincentivizes you a little bit. Not you, I'm just talking in general. I got your laugh. The Chinese system, we don't know. And so we guess. What are they intending? What are they doing? Are they preparing for war, or are they just this, for domestic purposes, ramping up the rhetoric, the bellicose rhetoric? It's very difficult. So in addition to being a hawk, in addition to preparing for war, you have to be a diplomat. This is not rocket science, but a lot of times the hawks are against diplomacy. They just want to be strong. And a lot of times the diplomats are, well, if you keep talking about war and preparing for war, we'll never get an understanding with them. And so you get this hawks and doves organization of the political sphere. And one side wants predominantly or even only diplomacy, and one side wants predominantly or only investment in the military. And you look at this and you say, but history shows that you need deterrence and diplomacy. You need to prepare for war so as not to fight war, but you need very strong diplomacy so that you reduce the possibility of disagreements, the possibility of miscalculation, the possibility of misinterpreting one side's intentions or the other. And it should be easy to combine deterrence and diplomacy. Chamberlain talked a little bit about deterrence, but it was all diplomacy. Right? Obama was all diplomacy, no deterrence. John Bolton in the Trump administration was, let's fight the war now since we have to fight it anyway. And what do we need the State Department for? And what do we need the UN for? Right? So sadly, we're polarized in this sphere of managing great power tensions. Great power tensions are normal. Now, Yvonne's marriage is different. But in my marriage, there are tensions. I can sometimes not be on best behavior. And my wife is a saint, but even she has limits. So we have to figure out how to manage those tensions because we don't want a war. I mean, she's got nuclear weapons, I've got nuclear weapons. The fate of the planet, right? Joking aside. And so we learn to manage these tensions. Again, not your marriage, we're talking about most marriages.
My wife has the nuclear weapon.
But you see my point, though. It's just normal to have tensions between great powers. This is not something that's unprecedented, right? If you don't know history, everything is unprecedented. Trump is unprecedented, sadly, if you don't know any history. So this is just normal history. Great power tensions, misperceptions, but they can be managed short of war. If you know how to walk and chew gum, deterrence and diplomacy at the same time. Great power war would be catastrophic. And that has to be the main focus of attention of any leader of a great power or superpower and the alliance structures that they have. And so I'm not satisfied with the management of the superpower, right? And I'm hoping for better management of this. I don't see it on the horizon. I see parties that I don't belong to, the Democrats and the Republicans, and I don't see this skill set. But I've seen it in the past, and therefore it's possible to bring it back.
But here's my question, because I agree very much, and you said, let's go back 50 years. This is the same type of confrontation, just the leading power on the Eurasian side changed. But in my view, there was one difference. And this was the ideological nature of the previous kind of power, because the Soviets believed that future belongs to them. There was a Marxism, you know, history. If I believe that future belongs to me, so better not to start the war now, better do it tomorrow, because tomorrow I'm going to be stronger. And on the American side also, there was a strong conviction, and this was canon, that time works for the United States, so there is no need to go for military confrontation. I'm afraid that what has changed, and I totally agree with you that basically, from geopolitical point of view, the situation is very similar, but the time horizon is changing. And the time horizon is changing because of something that you mentioned and didn't have time to develop, and this is demography. I could be wrong, but here's my hypothesis. You are the one, basically, have been telling us very much how the Russian Empire historically has been extending territorially, how much kilometers, square kilometers, basically you're getting per year. But the way I'm interpreting what I'm seeing, for the first time, it's not about land. It's about people. Yes. Because demography is something that is changing dramatically. Russia basically is now 146 million people. If you're going to listen what the President Putin has been talking in the last 6 months before the war, you're going to be surprised that in a conversation that has nothing to do with this, he was talking to students, for example, in Vladivostok, he was always making the same point. If it was not for the World War II, if it was not for the revolution, there are going to be 500 million Russians today. The idea was that there is not enough Russians. And basically all the policies on birth rates and so on didn't work. So the only successful policy of increasing your population was the annexation of Crimea. And this explains the abduction of kids and so on. As one of the Russian commentators said, Ukrainians are bewitched Russians. So from this point of view, you're fighting for population. You're not fighting for land. You're not fighting basically for this. And on the Ukrainian side, the same. Ukraine can resist. Probably they can stay for years. But the demographic cost can be so high of the people that they're losing is that they can lose the future while winning the war. And this is, in my view, new, because before the fear always was that there are too many people and not enough land. It was always about land, about black earth, about this and that. I'm very much interested in your reading of this, because I do believe you are a very strange voice in the comment on the war, because kind of your hard credentials on Russia have been never questioned, but you were the first which was basically very skeptical to the cartoon version, how all this is going to end up from day one.
That's a deep point. I appreciate it a lot. Why do you need people to fight a war? It's ironic, right? You fight the war in order to be able to fight the war. You fight the war to gain more people in order to gain more people to be able to fight wars. Russia has severe demographic crisis. And the projection going forward is poor for them. And if they want to be a great power, they need a larger population, but none of the pro-natal policies work. They haven't worked in any country for the most part, not any big country, that's for sure. Once women start to have opportunities and make choices, and once women are empowered to make, even partially empowered to make choices, and once fertility rates decline, they don't really come back. It's either immigration or bust, or conquest. But it doesn't work, because you lose more people than you gain in the war. And you can look at the tables and see how many people Russia's losing, either to death or to severe wounds that make them unable to continue fighting in the war or to participate in the workforce fully. And so it's a losing game, war on behalf of demographics. Here I'm concerned about the other theaters, if I could interject. So Iran, the average age in Iran in 1979, when they had the Islamist revolution, was 17. 17. You can do a lot of revolution with an average age of 17, especially 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old men. You can take over embassies. You can fight a cannon-fodder war with Iraq for years and years and years at unimaginable casualties. The average age in Iran today is 37. They can't do this anymore. They can't do it. Except if they find 17, 18, 19-year-olds with grievances somewhere else. Yeah. Gaza, Lebanon, and I could go on, where there are legitimate local grievances that are not invented by Iran, but where Iran finds what it calls its axis of resistance, because it doesn't have its own population of 17, 18, 19-year-old people who are expendable. And so this is deeply tragic, deeply, deeply tragic. Look at China. How many 18 to 24-year-olds does China have? 50 million. 50 million. They have this demographic catastrophe where the birth rate is producing fewer than 11 million, 9 million, even children a year. But they have 50 million 18 to 24-year-olds, a lot of whom have no marriage prospects. And so if you're going to go across the Taiwan Strait and 500,000 people going to sink and go to the bottom of the sea, you got another 500,000. And then you got another 500,000 after that. And so that scares the bejesus out of a lot of people, myself included. Because those lives, from the point of view of the regime, are expendable. Ukrainian lives in a flawed democracy, but a democracy, are not expendable. So a war of attrition, where lives don't matter, where you don't pay the costs and don't care, for an authoritarian regime is problematic even when they face demographic crisis. So again, we're not making the decisions. People in positions of power over there are making the decisions, and we shouldn't mirror our thinking to their thinking. So even though the demographic motivation for war doesn't work, that doesn't mean he doesn't think it works, or he doesn't think it's the best way forward. And on the Chinese side, it's very concerning to see this availability, as it were, of potential cannon fodder. One more point on the demography. Robots. People talk a lot about robots. Russia has the lowest percentage of robotization of any major economy in the world, whereas places like South Korea or Japan are leaders in this area. So not everybody is going to decline demographically the same way. Robots are not an answer for demographic decline, but they're a lot better than nothing. And Russia has not done anything about robotization, even in the military sphere to an extent, but certainly not in civilian life and medicine and in factories. The Chinese have looked at what the Japanese have achieved in this, and they're on their way to robotization, so that the shortfalls in the labor force can be managed potentially, making them available again for war. And then you have the issue of female labor participation and elderly labor participation. What is the pension rate? So demographics is a really big driver. In fact, the European Union will not survive unless it figures out what to do with Africa.
Thank you very much. And because we go to the end of our conversation, I want to ask you a question that, at least for me, is one of the biggest puzzle of what we see. Normally, political regimes, great powers, are paying price for their failures. My kind of sense is that in many places, in a certain way, they also now start to pay price for their successes. One of the biggest successes of China was one-child policy. The modernization of China, basically the economic growth, was very much to the fact that they were extremely successful to control the birth rates, and now they're going to pay the price for this. And now they're coming with the aging population, major kind of a disbalance between girls and boys among the younger generation and so on. European Union, the major success was to make the war unthinkable.
Yes.
And basically, and Europe succeeded. And now the major vulnerability of Europe is that we make the war unthinkable, so even if the war is coming, Europe's response to the war is, by the way, like in this American movie in which a guy had been never leaving his apartment, just watching the television and changing the channels. So when he was robbed on the street, he didn't know what to do, and he tried to change the channel. And in a certain way, this is the story, but it was at the same time the biggest success of Europe, the pacification of the European mind. There was this great book, Where Have All Soldiers Gone? And my idea is how you're trying to mobilize political support exactly when you should confront the consequences not of your failures, but of your successes. And by the way, this is true also for the United States for many things, including migration policies and others. So how you're functioning in the world where governments are paralyzed not by failure, but what till yesterday was their major success?
Yes. Reagan privatized the airline industry, several other industries. You can't do that again. Once Reagan succeeds at some of the policies that he's aiming for, he makes it impossible to be Reagan, which is one reason why somebody tall but overweight could come along and just knock aside this hollow structure, because its very success made it superfluous going forward. The same thing happened to the left with the welfare state. The left woke up one day, and now its job was to partially dismantle the welfare state to bring more fiscal balance. Its very success undermined its ability to continue to succeed. Cold War institutions built for the Soviet Union in a different epoch with different communications networks and a different sense of distances and different organization of global trade, they're gigantic legacy institutions that you still have. 36% of global R&D was the Pentagon. Global R&D, 36% was the Pentagon. In 1960, that late. That doesn't work anymore. You have this gigantic organization that trips over itself. And the software in this thing is superior to the software in a majority of the equipment that the advanced Pentagon is using. Its success in building this huge state planning committee known as the Pentagon to build gigantic weapon systems to stand up to the Soviet Union has now become an unbelievable vulnerability. And so all success creates new problems, new challenges, And in fact, the success itself can be the new problem, a new challenge. But you have corrective mechanisms. The corrective mechanisms are known as the market and democracy and rule of law. And they're imperfect. And they don't always work the way we hope they're going to work. And they disappoint us all the time. But there's a big difference between the presence of corrective mechanisms, which citizens can use to help shape their futures and the futures for their, and systems that don't have corrective mechanisms, right? And so that's our advantage that we don't want to squander. But let me just mention the dual use problem, which I skipped in the presentation because I thought I was going to be briefer than the previous lecture. That was ridiculous, huh? I skipped over so many things saying I'll skip this and I'll skip that and I'll be 40 minutes instead of 2 hours. Everything is dual use now. This is unbelievably complex. Back in the day, not your day, but my day, back in the day there was something called the military-industrial complex. And that was gigantic factories producing missiles and submarines and tanks and munitions, and it was enormous. And it was separate, the military-industrial complex. You knew it was different from the civilian economy. Now, this is the military-industrial complex. All civilian goods are dual use. That is to say, they have consumer applications and military applications. And so everything that everybody does potentially needs to be controlled, prohibited, followed, so that it doesn't end up enhancing the military capabilities of your adversary. And so you do things like produce mushrooms that are a platform in biotechnology to produce not just food, but all sorts of materials that make up clothes or medicines. So those mushrooms for your bioengineering, they can be used for military purposes, bioengineering. So do you need to prohibit the export of your genetically modified mushrooms to the Chinese? Do you need not to have Chinese in your laboratories, whether here in Europe or in the UK or in the United States or in Japan? Right? These are questions we didn't face before. So not only does success potentially create these challenges greater than the challenges that you solved, but you don't know which end is up. Everything is one of these cliche, kitsch Escher paintings that you had on the wall at college. You discovered that this Escher thing was feeding on itself and there was no end to it, and it turns out that that guy was right. And everything is dual use. Everything is this Escher. We all thought it was Munch, the Scream. We also had that on the wall in college. Well, I had that on the wall. You didn't have that on the wall. You guys were better than that. But my point is that where did that come from? The solution in civilian economy work, in the innovation ecosystem, for so many everyday challenges that made life better, has now threatened us in ways that are unimaginable from the old military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex now largely needs to be killed, and we need to build a new version based upon faster, smarter, better, cheaper, etc. But doing that and not undermining ourselves at the same time has become a challenge much greater than we understood. So everything is like that. People worry. We haven't mentioned climate stuff tonight, another area that we skipped. People talk about solving the climate crisis. Right? Well, we solved the energy problem for the Earth through luck. 300 million years ago, Mother Nature, underneath the Earth, layered in hydrocarbons. And much, much later, we discovered this amazing energy that was right there under the ground that we could just harvest. And it was portable, and transportable and across huge distances, and it could power everything and anything much better than wood, or much better than steam, or much better than dung. But lo and behold, that solution has caused immense other challenges. And so as we think about, quote, solving the climate crisis, we're going to discover all sorts of problems that we're going to be creating that we didn't want to create, but are part of the process of... So problems can be managed rather than solved. This is humility, right? This is striving, trying, doing everything you can, but having humility about perverse and unintended consequences, and having humility about permanent solutions. As long as you have the corrective mechanisms built in, you can solve even the problems you unintentionally created. You can at least address them and manage them. And so this is really pretty remarkable. We're in an epoch that was hard to imagine. The prosperity that we've enjoyed. Think about this. The people who made up the 20% poverty rate in the United States that 50 years ago, if they were measured the same way today, they would be 2% of the US population. Now, we still have mass poverty because it's a relational, it's a completely relational measurement. But we're poor in different ways now. Some ways the same, but many ways different. Poor people have these mobile computers. That doesn't solve their problems, but it makes them different from the people previously. So we're in an epoch where if you measure health or availability of technology, or all sorts of other indicators, infant mortality, female mother birth mortality, everything has declined massively based upon historic indicators, but not sufficiently. We're still unsatisfied, and we still feel we have to solve these problems, but we focus less on the achievements and more on the disappointments, and as I said, the mood is becoming more and more sour. But the corrective mechanisms and the innovation ecosystem and the empowerment of people through some of the ways that we're talking about is the killer app. It's what differentiates us. Again, unsatisfying. Again, disappointing. Again, full of failure and shortcomings, but astonishing. You know, even though I know the history that I know and I work on what I work on, I'm trying to give a hopeful, optimistic presentation.
Thank you very much. And do you know what? What I learned... What I have learned from your answer is that we should stop here, otherwise we are going to become the victim of your success. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay,